So welcome everyone to our Lev Shestov event. My name is Christoph Schneider. I'm the academic director of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies. Just a few words about how this event came to be. Some months ago, Dr. Marina Ogden joined our institute as a visiting research fellow, and she did a lot of work on Shestov. And we thought it's a good idea to organize an event about Shestov. And more recently, we started to read Shestov in our theology and philosophy reading group. Kevin is here because Shestov obviously belongs to the movement of Russian religious thought and the many parallels to other Russian thinkers such as Solovyov, Bulgakov, and Florensky, but he obviously makes a unique contribution. There are many significant differences as well because he has a Jewish background as opposed to the other Russian thinkers who are Christian Orthodox thinkers. And today we would like to learn more about these very interesting but also unconventional thinkers. So the program for today is to have a 30-minute paper first. Our first speaker I will introduce in a moment is Professor David Patterson. A paper about 30 minutes, then we have time for discussion, about 30 minutes. We can also have a longer discussion if that's required. Then a short break, and then the second paper will be delivered by Marina Ogden, who is also an expert on Shestov, and then we'll conclude the session with another discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, very distinguished speaker. It is Professor David Patterson. He holds the Hillel R. Feinberg Distinguished Chair in Holocaust Studies at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas. He is also a Senior Research Fellow for the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy. His research interests are, among other things, the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, Jewish literature, Jewish history, and modern Jewish thought, but he also did a lot of work on Russian and European literature. He published many books. I can't mention all of them. There is a page dedicated to Professor Patterson on Amazon, so please visit this page if you're interested in his work. And there's one title that caught my attention in particular. It's a book that he published about 10 years ago with the title Anti-Semitism and Its Metaphysical Origins. That is certainly a book that is also of relevance to Christian theology and Christian thinkers. So we're very pleased that Professor Patterson has accepted our invitation. And today he's going to talk about Between the Tree of Knowledge and the Tree of Life, Lev Shestov's second dimension of thought. And as you can see, it's an online presentation. Professor Patterson, thank you very much for coming, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Marina, for the invitation. I'm very grateful. So let's get started. Lev Shestov's notion of the second dimension of thought is grounded in biblical thought, resting in Job's balances in the tension between the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. For the thinker, Shestov, what distinguishes the tree of knowledge from the tree of life is not merely the content of thought, but more importantly, the categories that shape thinking itself. The categories of speculative thought, for example, are shaped by the law of contradiction and syllogistic logic belonging to the tree of knowledge, while the categories of the second dimension of thought, such as outcry, lamentation, and rejoicing, belong to the tree of life. The tension between the two, however, is not reducible to an opposition between just faith and reason, as we often understand that, because faith for Shestov is not reducible, as he says, to the assent of the understanding to what is believed, as Thomas Aquinas defines it, for example. Faith is a mode of thought and not the acquiescence of belief. Faith, quoting Shestov, faith is not reliance on what has been told us. Faith is a new dimension of thought, unknown to and foreign to speculative philosophy, which opens the way to the creator of all things, the source of all possibilities. Yes, the creator of all things, not the first cause or unmoved mover. As we shall see, the category perhaps most fundamental to what Shestov calls a new dimension of thought is creation. In the beginning, God created. That's it's fundamental to biblical thinking. So more than just a new dimension of thought, faith is an alternative dimension of thought. It arises from this juxtaposition between tree of knowledge and tree of life. In many ways, the two trees at the center of the garden have shaped the history of human understanding as that history unfolds between Athens and Jerusalem, between Hellenistic and Hebraic ways of thinking. Stemming from Athens, the project of knowledge lies in comprehension and control and power and possession. Proceeding with open eyes, knowledge seeks the security of the firm ground. As we see in the story of Thales, the first speculative philosopher. When Thales was walking along one night, looking up at the sky, contemplating the wonders of the heavens, he fell into a pit. He climbed out of the pit and resolved never again to take a step without being certain of the firm ground beneath his feet. This resolve, however, of course, came at the expense of his view of the heavens, the dimension of height, from which the holiness of the Holy One emanates. As Seneca once said, a quote that Shestov sometimes cites, if you would submit all things to yourself, submit yourself to reason. In other words, submit to the temptation of the serpent, who falsely promises that the fruit of the forbidden tree will make you like God, not only knowing, but determining good and evil, wielding a godlike control over all things. You will be safe. The tree of life, on the other hand, opens up the heart, not the eyes. For only the heart can behold what is most precious, what is most dear. Only the heart can behold the highest. As Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, blessed is he who knows that within and above are synonyms. So the path opened up by the tree of life is the path of offering and giving, not the path of power and possession. It is the path of elevation, sanctification, and revelation, not the path of acquisition, control, and reason. As Shestov says, within the limits of reason, and I'm quoting him, one may create a science, a lofty morality, even a religion. But in order to find God, one must tear oneself away from the seductions of reason and go to another source. In Scripture, it is called, says Shestov, by the mysterious word faith, that dimension of thought through which truth joyfully gives itself over to the everlasting and uncontrollable disposition of the Creator. Yes, joyfully. There is no faith, no wisdom, no truth without rejoicing. Reason is the way of enjoyment. Faith is the way of rejoicing. Reason is the way of gratification of the ego. Faith is the way of gratitude to and for the other. Jewish tradition, and as mentioned, Shestov was a Jew. Jewish tradition teaches that in the time of the Messiah, all the sacrifices will cease except offerings of thanksgiving. Indeed, the Messiah stems from the tribe of Yehuda, Judah, whose name means one who is grateful. With this acquisition of property and power, on the other hand, to whom or what should reason give thanks? To whom does reason give thanks? And yet, thanksgiving lies at the heart of our humanity. There's no covenantal relation, whether human relation or higher relation, without gratitude. The second dimension of thought is steeped in gratitude, and a gratitude that is grateful before knowing or seeing what there is to be grateful for. You recall the exchange between Ivan Karamazov and his brother Alyosha. And Ivan asks Alyosha, how am I to love life if I don't know its meaning? To which Alyosha answers, it's only by first loving life that you can ever hope to know its meaning. And the love for life begins with gratitude. Characterized by giving thanks, steeped in a love for life, covenantal faith is rooted in the act of giving, not in the act of giving in. It's the opposite of acquiescence or submission. Stated differently, covenantal faith is rooted in a relationship. Apart from the relationship, faith is meaningless. It is not a feeling that lurks inside of us, but a living presence between an I and a thou. The sola fide, by faith alone, that inspires Shestov, may be read as by relationship alone, where relationship means fundamentally the God relationship, which is expressed in the human relationship. Rooted in that relationship, covenantal faith would pose a question to the Creator for the sake of life, as in the case of Abraham and Job. Will the judge of the world be unjust? The God of the covenant, the creator of heaven and earth, wants us to ask, it demands that we ask. For he puts to himself a question, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? This is on the indication of Sodom and Gomorrah. So as the Holy One declares near the end of the book of Job, a book that Shestov studied thoroughly, he says, my servant Job spoke rightly. He spoke rightly. Even after God rebukes him, my servant Job spoke rightly, and you, the comforters, did not, because he spoke on behalf of life from the tree of life. Now, situated between these two primordial trees, at the center of creation, we stand between Athens and Jerusalem, the title of Shestov's perhaps best known work, where we have to choose between Athens and Jerusalem, between a Hellenistic mode of thought and a Hebraic mode of thought. As in the time of the Maccabees, when in 167, before the Common Era, the Jews of Judea resisted the oppression of Hellenism and the desecration of the temple at the hands of the Greeks and the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Judah Maccabee led the revolt against the Hellenists. His name, Maccabee, means the hammer, as in the hammer of God, a phrase that Shestov invokes in Athens and Jerusalem. The basic categories that shape Hellenistic thinking, the categories smashed by the hammer of God, the hammer of faith, are causation, deduction, and perfection, attained through knowing, through knowledge, knowing all the answers and wielding all the power. If all that is real is rational, as Hegel says, then reason may rule over all things. The age of reason thus gave birth to modern totalitarianism. Hellenistic thought is solipsistic, so that the thinker's being is grounded in his or her own autonomous thinking ego. I think, therefore I am. Instead of what? Instead of God has created me, therefore I am. God has summoned me, therefore I am. God has questioned me. So Opposite the isolation of the thinking ego, the ego that weighs, measures, and counts, we have the covenantal relation to the creator. It's a way of thinking from within a relationship, and it's exemplified in Shestov. In his book, in Job's Balances, where we have a very good example of this. What does Job place in the balances that could weigh heavier than the sands of the sea? It is not only his anguish and despair, but also the truth that he longs for, which cannot be deduced, but rather is revealed only in what Kierkegaard calls the God relationship. So the categories that shape Hebraic biblical thinking, the thinking of Job, the patriarchs, the prophets, are creation, revelation, and a redemption that remains undecided. For redemption lies in nothing that meets the eye and forever eludes the grasp. So we hear Shestov argues. He says, as long as we have the light, reason, and truth of Hellenistic thought, we drive revelation away from us. Light in this instance is the natural light, the Cartesian lumen naturale of reason, which Shestov views as a darkness that reason would pass off as light. It's the darkness of the ninth plague of Egypt, in which no man could see the face of his brother, as it is written. The truth that he invokes is not the truth of what there is to hold dear, but the counterfeit that is confused with syllogistic necessity, which is the object of knowledge, not the essence of life. Truth is not a dead datum, but a living presence that dwells between two, between God and human, between human and human. Now, Shestov believes that the question that decides all of philosophy is the question of whether the serpent or God is the deceiver. Coiled around the tree of knowledge, the serpent holds out the illusion of security and safety and plays not just on our fear of death, but even more so our fear of life and its uncertainties. When God called out to Adam, "Where are you?" Adam answered, "I was hiding because I was afraid." And here the Midrash poses a question, where did he hide? And the Midrash says Adam hid inside the tree of knowledge where we all hide. What are we hiding from? From reckoning, accountability, responsibility, all the things that shape the relationship. We're hiding from an infinite responsibility for what is infinitely precious. So as Dostoevsky put it, each of us is responsible for all, and I more than the others. And yet, without this responsibility, without this reckoning, without the question God put to the first human being and to each of us, where are you? We can never be free. The fear of life is the fear of freedom. Curled up inside the tree of knowledge, we never live, but only hope to live. Like says here in this connection, Shestov writes, like everything that bears the mark of mystery, freedom harbors an inner contradiction. And the contradiction consists in this. Freedom does not mean doing anything we desire, but rather lies in the realization and revelation of what we must do, not out of necessity, but in the light of a summons to stand before the Creator and declare, Hineni, here I am for you. As Shestov affirms, freedom is the relationship of man to God. For only in this relationship to the Creator of life can meaning be lived and not just known. Meaning is not known, meaning is lived. What is freedom? It's the capacity not to make meaning, whatever that could possibly mean, but to hear the voice of meaning that has already chosen us and questions us, as in the case of Cain. Where is your brother and what have you done? After the blood of Abel cries out to God, God asks Cain, where's your brother and what have you done? If freedom lies in the relationship of man to God, as Shestov maintains, it lies in the ability to respond to the question that God puts to each of us every day, every hour. Where are you? Where's your brother? What have you done? Succumbing to the serpent, our first impulse is to reject both the question and the one who asks. By posing our own question, am I my brother's keeper? What do I have to do with my brother? Without the God relationship, we have no human relationship. Without the God relationship, we are turned over to the horror of a realm in which there are no brothers, no fathers, no daughters. Without the God relationship, who is there to ask? Where are you? Where is your brother? What have you done? Who asked? The first cause? The unmoved mover? The false gods of reason's worship? No, no one asks. And we do not have to answer to anything or anyone except our illusory ego. Without the reckoning that God demands of us, without the question of life born from the tree of life, life would be a horror. As in the words of Shestov, where the fallen man, the knowing man, perceives the path to salvation, death awaits him. Not only his own death, but the death of his brother. As history has shown, beginning with Cain, the totalitarian project spawned by the tree of knowledge leads either to murder or to suicide. Franz Rosenzweig, a great Jewish thinker, said that the Western speculative tradition can only and recommend only one thing, and that is suicide. So in its effort to become as God and thus usurp God, the reason born of the tree of knowledge comes up short. For knowledge would know the first cause of all there is, whereas life does not lie in knowledge, but in a relationship. The creator who is beyond all there is, beyond knowledge, beyond the categories of knowledge. As Shestov says, God does not know anything. God creates everything. Nor do we know God. Any so-called knowledge of God lies in a realization that we are being questioned by God. It's a realization. It's not a deduction. It's a revelation. As Shestov puts it, God signifies that the knowledge for which our reason strives so eagerly and to which it draws us so irresistibly does not exist. God signifies that there are only the primeval fiat, let there be, and the heavenly valde bonum, the very good, before which other laws fade away, as Shestov puts it. And by laws, he means natural law, laws of necessity, and not the ethical demand of where's your brother, not the responsibility that devolves on all of us, which is not a matter of law, it's a matter of relation. So in Hebrew, the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the Etz da'at tov v'ra, the tree of knowledge, meaning in Hebrew da'at, joining together. So there's no distinction between good and evil. There's no good, no evil, but only the will to power. Now, with regard to the valde bonum, I think this is an important phrase in the quote from Shestov. On each of the first 5 days of creation, except the second day, God pronounced his work to be good. But on the sixth day, it was tov me'od, very good. Tov is good, me'od is translated as very. But me'od actually means more. It was good and more than good. But how can there be something more than good? What is more than good? The good is increased, the good becomes more through the creation of the human being. The human being is more than being, a breach of being. And the sign of the human being being more, according to the rabbis, is his death. So Rabbi Meir in the Talmud says the me'od in tov me'od, or the valde in the valde bonum, signifies the death that we die for the sake of another. Underlying the commandment to love our neighbor is our fear for his death, even unto dying for his sake. So the death that we die when we consume the fruit of the tree of knowledge is the death that is meaningless for the sake of nothing and no one. Whereas knowledge can offer us nothing and no one to die for, the tree of life reveals what is infinitely dear, and the infinite dearness of the life of the human being, of God himself, and therefore who there is to die for. So the tree of life opens up the path to martyrdom. The tree of knowledge opens up the path to murder or suicide. If, as Shestov says, the tree of knowledge has forever hidden from man the tree of life, it has hidden from man this meaning of the very and very good. The tree of knowledge occludes the tree of life, Shestov explains, because it insists that we turn away from everything to which our joys and sorrows, our hopes, longings, despairs, and so on are bound, including our love of our fellow human being. Born from the fruits of the tree of knowledge, the Heidegger's famous Sein zum Tod is an egoistic concern for my death, wherever our thinking stems from the tree of life. Rooted in the second dimension of thought, the death that concerns me is the death of the other. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic, said that one of the wisdom that he learned fundamentally was, as he said in the Meditations, not to regard anything at all, though ever so little, but right and reason, and always, note this, always, whether in sharpest pains or after the loss of a child, or in long diseases, to still be the same calm man. The death of a child. This is not Job. Marcus Aurelius is not Job. So let me just bridge some of this for the sake of time. In a very important contrast, Shestov lays out the second dimension of thought in this contrast between Spinoza's non ridere, non lugere, neque te testare, sed intelligere, which is laugh not, weep not, curse nothing, but understand, like Marcus Aurelius, Spinoza, and Pascal's chercher en gémissant, to seek with lamentation. This lamentation is not just a cry of anguish, but is a crying out, a call of deep unto deep, a prayer, as in the case of the psalmist and Job and the prophets, or of anyone who has walked the halls of St. Jude's Hospital, Children's Hospital. The second dimension of thought is, among other things, thought in the mode of prayer. And the prayer is addressed to a who, not a what. The tree of knowledge, Shestov points out, means the renunciation of every who, both human and divine. The God of Abraham is a who and not a what, a living presence and not a first principle. No one cries out Father to the first principle or the first cause or the unmoved mover. The second dimension of thought is the revelation, brings with it the revelation of a who and not the deduction of a what. Without the who, there's no relation, there's no covenant, there's no why. Which returns me to a very significant category that shapes the second dimension of thought. It's the category of creation. That the first line in the Torah, which itself is called the Etz Chaim, the tree of life, as Shestov knew very well. The first line, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bereshit means not the first in a sequence of things, but the most important thing, the most fundamental thing is that God created. Taking place as it does through a divine word, creation is a movement into a relationship, a word spoken by someone, by a who, and not a what. And the relationship, this movement into a relationship is indicated by the word bara in Hebrew itself. Bara is a cognate of brit, and brit is covenant. The movement of creation is a movement into a covenantal relation, as suggested by the word bara itself. And it's a movement undertaken by a who in the creation of a you, of a human, of a ultimately creation of a who in the image and likeness of the Holy One himself. Um, so, in keeping with the second dimension of thought, that opens up a dimension of height, as we have seen. The Midrash teaches that God creates the heavens prior to the earth in order to establish a dimension of height from which all that below receives its meaning. Where do we encounter dimension of height? Not in the isolation of our abstract speculation. No. Speculation cannot accommodate a dimension of height that lies above all that there is. Second dimension of thought thinks in terms of a more than all, which is unintelligible to speculation. So this dimension of height is revealed not in the abstractions of speculation, but in the concrete encounter with this flesh and blood human being. Revelation is a matter that concerns flesh and blood. As Job says, though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. In the encounter with a flesh and blood human being, we are shaken from the sleep of our complacency, a sleep that descends upon us with our consumption of the fruit of the forbidden tree. Realizing that I do not deduce what is needful, that I do not determine whether I am called, that I am who I am lies in my capacity to answer, here I am for you. I realize that who I am lies not in my autonomous self-legislation, but in the heteronomy of this disturbance by the concrete presence of the other human being. So what is most important, Shestov writes, it lies beyond the limits of the understandable and the explainable. What exactly is most important and therefore most essential to the relationship through which the soul draws its breath, the breath of life, it is quite simply love. Love. Love is the second dimension of thought. Love is not a feeling, but a living presence between two. So Shestov writes, without love, all the gifts of knowledge amount to nothing. So fundamental among the commandments in Christianity and in Judaism, the two greatest commandments, love God, love your neighbor. In the commandment to love your neighbors, in the book of Leviticus, it's written, "V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha." You shall love your neighbor as yourself. More literally, the kamocha, which is actually mistranslated as as yourself, means that is who you are. In other words, who you are lies in this loving relationship to your neighbor who is a child of God. As Shestov says, we are inclined to think that the prophets meant only idols of gold and silver. However, it is not a matter of gold and silver, but of the fact that man sets a work of his own hands in the place of God. He goes on, says, ideal idols are hated as much by the prophets as the idols of any crude material. There's no room for love in ideology or in the solipsistic musings of speculation. God calls out to us, behold, I have set before you this day life and good, death and evil. So choose life, the tree of life, so that you may endure, you and your seed. The struggle with idolatry, the struggle between Athens and Jerusalem, between the tree of knowledge and the tree of life is to the death, because it is a struggle against death in the name of life and the love of the life of the other human being. The tree of life is the tree of love. So let me end with this, but perhaps we can better understand Berdyaev's claim that Shestov is a man for whom philosophy is a matter of life and death. I think Berdyaev is right about that. Like Jacob, Shestov wrestles with the angel of death for the sake of life and love. Shestov's second dimension of thought is rooted in a way of life steeped in a love for God and neighbor as commanded in the Bible. In his every word, his every thought, there lies a summons to return to life in a leap or a dance of faith through the love of the other, both human and divine. And we are the ones who are called. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Patterson, for your wonderful presentation that brought Shestov theology very much alive. Our second speaker is Dr. Marina Ogden. She's a visiting research fellow at our institute, the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies, and also an affiliate researcher in modern languages and cultures at the University of Glasgow. Marina Ogden is an artist as well as an academic, and her research interests lie at the intersection of the philosophy of art, philosophy of culture, religious studies, psychoanalysis, and art theory. And she's particularly interested, as you already know, in the work of Lev Shestov and Russian religious thought. Her first book appeared in 2021 with the title Lev Shestov's Angel of Death, Memory, Trauma, and Rebirth. And her second book is on the renewal of art. It's a book on Warburg, Kandinsky, and Shestov. And I think it has already been published or is about to be published this year or in the next month. Okay, excellent.
Possibly at the start of next year now, because I'm still editing it.
Early next year, 26.
Well, yes, I find mistakes, a lot of them, all the time.
It's endless.
It's a bit of a delay.
Okay. So Marina today is going to talk about Lev Shestov on freedom, faith, and a new dimension of thought, his revolt against reason. Marina, over to you.
Thank you, Christoph, and thank you everyone for attending today. And thank you, Professor Patterson, for your very eloquent talk. I will continue on the subject of creation. Oops. Just a moment. I just to. Oh yeah, thank you. The creator of an alternative strand of philosophic inquiry and the new concept of what thinking means. Lev Shestov's thought had a lot to do with the discontinuation of the 19th century belief that reason is an irresistible force for human emancipation. In the last 7 to 10 years, the thoughts of Lev Shestov have gained a noteworthy resurgence of interest. This is not surprising, as according to Nikolai Berdyaev, quote, Shestov's books help provide an answer to the fundamental problem of human existence. They have an existential significance, end of quote. Having stood the test of time, in the 21st century, Shestov's ideas attract the attention not only of scholars of philosophy and religion, but also a wider readership, including intellectuals from all over the world. As Vladimir Shalyar, a contemporary philosopher and theologian, writes, quote, only now we're able to begin to understand the creative work of Lev Shestov in its real and enormous significance. Shestovian oeuvre offers a totality of answers to the questions which we only recently learned to formulate, end of quote. Shalyar associates Shestov's philosophical outlook with a post-metaphysical and non-material turn of contemporary philosophy, and he suggests that Shestov's thought paved the way to the new turns of philosophy, having accomplished a radical deconstruction of all philosophical tradition, from Anaximander to Husserl. Echoing Berdyaev's words, Shalyar specifies that, quote, the world to which Shestov is calling us is not another world, because another world would be exactly the metaphysical world, but this world in which we live in, end of quote. The most recent success of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky, Shestov in his writings formed the question paramount for Europe in the aftermath of the First World War, the question of the human destiny in the contemporary world. As Shestov wrote in a letter to Sergei Bulgakov, he was deeply concerned with, quote, the nightmare of godlessness and unbelief which has taken hold of humanity. Born in 1866 in Kiev, Shestov's thoughts were preoccupied with the unchangeability of the past and stagnant condition of Western philosophy. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Shestov's paradoxical thought struggled against the modern ideal of the optimal and unlimited power of science that had subjected the recalcitrant forces of human nature to its theoretical laws. As Berdyaev attested, Shestov's independence of the tendencies of the time in which he lived was astonishing. Emerging against the background of the ferment of ideas of Russian literary philosophical culture and the European intellectual tradition of the 19th century, Shestov's philosophy functioned as, I quote, a provoking and inspiring thorn in the flesh of rationalistic philosophy and its sane securities, end of quote. During his lifetime, Shestov remained a writer for the few, and yet his influence reached deeper than one might surmise from the number of copies his works sold. Already in his early writing, Shestov points out the fundamental differences between philosophy, which is based on theory and governed by logic, and philosophy that is derived from one's personal experience of life and unique view of reality. A characteristic feature of Shestov's philosophical worldview is his rejection of the overpowering authority of human reason with its compulsion to believe in axiomatic self-evident truths. In an effort to create a new sensitivity in the domain of thought, Shestov tried to establish a way of thinking alternative to the type of thought that is dominated and controlled by reason. For, according to him, philosophy must have nothing in common with logic, because the habit of logical thinking kills imagination. Philosophy, he writes, is an art which aims at breaking the logical continuity of argument and bringing man out on the shoal sea of imagination, the fantastic tides, where everything is equally possible and impossible, end of quote. Shestov proposes that, unlike speculative philosophy, existential philosophy stems from the view of the world in consideration of the tragic reality of human existence, and it does not bow before the tribunal of reason. A major theme that defines all Shestov's thought is the struggle for faith and an original attempt to restore the human primordial right to God. From his earliest publications in Kiev and St. Petersburg in the late 1890s, Shestov's writing was stimulated by his concern with the profound and tragic abyss of human life and death. For Shestov, thinking originates in a moment of vulnerability, the moment in which the boundaries between human and divine have melted. In his account, human life is intrinsically contradictory, and therefore its truth lives by contradictions. Shestov criticizes contemporary thinkers for their inability to think beyond the framework of logical proofs and for their efforts to avoid contradiction. Metaphysical truth, according to him, cannot endure contradiction, since such truth must always be proven. Quote, "The degree of truth of any kind of metaphysical affirmation stands in inverse proportion to its acceptability for reason." End of quote. For example, if we affirm that rays of light move in straight lines, then anyone who affirms they move in crooked lines is no longer in truth, but in lie. This means that everything that can resist a verification effectuated according to the criteria established by this truth must be rejected as false. Shestov argues that the theory of knowledge, which has developed based on Aristotle's fundamental presupposition that the single worthwhile knowledge is scientific knowledge, raised knowledge to the level of the ideal, and in that it mistakenly became identified with truth. He writes, quote, "Philosophy from olden times has established as its unwavering principle that any truth ought to be verified, and that prior to stepping out with some truth, man is obliged to devise a special philosopher's stone, which is called a criterion, end of quote. Modern philosophy, Shestov continues, which has made herself the handmaid of science, is convinced that questions ought to be made of indifferent, worthless material, quote, but it should hold and ask itself, of what are questions made? Perhaps it would then renounce the idea of transforming all that is important into the imperceptible, which is so imperceptible that it cannot be seen, end of quote. Shestov suggests that outside our general principles, past our cognizing reason, flow the most remarkable and significant events of our existence. Because, quote, to think, really to think, surely means a relinquishing of logic. It means living a new life. It means a permanent sacrifice of the dearest habits, tastes, attachments, without even assurance that the sacrifice will bring any compensation, end of quote. From the point of view of existential and sensory experience, the tragedy of human existence does not conform to idealistic, positivist, and materialistic systems of thinking. And, quote, if Kant wanted to reform metaphysics, he should have got rid of its favorite method of obtaining truths through inferential conclusions, end of quote. Emphatically, for Shestov, truth, in order to be truth, doesn't have to be accepted by everyone. It gets through life without showing any sort of documentary titles and doesn't need proof. He contrasts science with philosophy, putting the latter in the domain of human creative activities. Quote, I hope that sooner or later, philosophy will thus be defined in contrast to science. Philosophy is the teaching of truths which are binding on none, end of quote. The idea that in the course of the centuries, the theories of knowledge had concealed the revealed truth preoccupied Shestov's thoughts. According to him, two kinds of truths, revealed and scientific, fight out together a supreme final battle between life and death, between real and ideal. Following Dostoevsky, Shestov remained faithful to the Eastern Orthodox tradition of compassion for the defeated and the suffering. He maintained that when we are confronted by human suffering, truths provided by rational knowledge lose their effective power. For Dostoevsky, as for Shestov, human suffering is not only a means of breaking through egoism to a larger, more compassionate view of life, but also a way to entering into and participating in the sufferings of Christ. Referring to the traumatic event of the mock execution experienced by Dostoevsky in 1849, Shestov writes, quote, when Dostoevsky hung on the cross, he doubted everything and doubted to the end. His books gained intention from this, but his philosophical conception lost all sweetness that is typical of what is known as a synthesis. End of quote. For Shestov, as it is for Dostoevsky, quote, deliverance from suffering must involve more than material betterment, and freedom must have a decisive role in any truly productive response. End of quote. Freedom is the ultimate human value for Shestov. For him, freedom implies a struggle. It must be striven for in order to be achieved. Because, this is a quote from Ivan Turgenev, without freedom in the widest sense, freedom within oneself, freedom from preconceived ideas, freedom with regard to one's own nation and history, without this, the real artist is unthinkable. End of quote. Coming from this perspective, Shestov could not agree that philosophy should be the science of absolute truths, which justify what he saw as the tyranny of reason and of the power of knowledge. He began his search for what he called the other or ultimate truth, describing it with reference to Kant. As I quote, a kind of living entity which doesn't stand before us uninterested and indifferent, waiting passively till we approach and take her." End of quote. Shestov looked intently for the possibility of liberation of the human mind from the constraints of logical predictability. In his essay dedicated to the 100th anniversary of Dostoevsky's birth, Shestov goes as far as to suggest that the true critique of pure reason was not Kant's achievement, but Dostoevsky's. In the essay, Shestov tells the story of Dostoevsky's receiving the mysterious gift of a new pair of eyes from the angel of death, drawing on the writer's life experience. An original interpretation of Dostoevsky's life and work, the captivating legend of the angel of death invokes symbolic and metaphorical connotations. In relation to Dostoevsky's traumatic experience of the mock execution and the years of penal servitude in Siberia, Shestov proposes that following the near-death encounter, Dostoevsky received the precious gift of the second vision from the wings of the angel. The angel of death, the angel with 1,000 eyes, sometimes visits a man, not to take him, but to leave him a new set of eyes, writes Shestov. The revelation brings the dying person back to life. Quote, "All great events of the human soul are accompanied by the most agonizing tears." Unquote. Shestov emphasizes, though, that such an advance beyond accepted rational norms invokes an internal struggle at the level of human consciousness. Shestov does not deny that life is absurd, quite the contrary. For him, the idea that life has meaning implies the recognition that life is absurd. According to his telling, the miraculous power of that monstrous absurdity can carry us beyond the limits of human comprehension and of the possibilities which that comprehension admits. A confrontation with life's absurdity is an opportunity for a fearless venture into an unknown redemption that may conceal a hidden and mysterious meaning. The form of the parable, which is narrative and symbolic at the same time, allowed Shestov to create a text as a living work in which the interplay of the semantic fields of the dynamic narrative and metaphor signifies something more, something else, something more that continue their course beyond the narrative. Given the symbolic and metaphorical potentiality of the parable of the angel of death, the transition between semiotic application and interpretation finds its fulfillment in the thought and imagination of the reader, contributing to the interpretative dynamism of the text. Put another way, the text interprets before having been interpreted. In his mature work, the philosopher advances the thesis that only having moved away from the world of reason to the other side of proofs can the individual human reach out to the unknown or a new dimension of thought. He argues that beyond science and philosophy lies another region of knowledge, and, quote, "Through all the ages, men, each one at his own risk, have sought to penetrate into this region," end of quote. Shestov observes that at times a person may become aware of the intolerable oppressiveness and monstrousness of reason. At that moment, the individual human experiences a yearning to break out of the world of eternal truths with its necessities and constraints, and to enter a different order of being in which the freedom that he still dimly feels ought to be not denied him. Appropriately, John Bailey describes Shestov's thought as a model of sanity and common sense. Shestov is not completely opposed to scientific knowledge and the use of reason in everyday life. His main criticism of reason is that its universal objectivity lacks the stamp of the individual thinker, and that implies an element of compulsion. More importantly, he objects to the pretensions of science and reason to explain the question of God. A courageous seeker of truth as Sergei Bulgakov describes him, Shestov rejects the ideals of rational thought and the belief in reason as the ultimate authority. He maintains that the philosophers of Western tradition substituted the God of Hebrew scriptures with the cult of reason. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was replaced by the God of the theologians and the philosophers, and subordinated to human reason. For Shestov, by contrast, God is not bound by any kind of necessary truths, and not bound by anything. As for God, all things are possible. According to him, the absolutely free God of the Bible creates absolutely free reality, the world of multiple truths, variable views, and never-ending changeability. And this world, Shestov insists, is not a metaphysical world. Shestov contends that only after freeing oneself from theoretical knowledge and moral ideals can one find true faith. For true faith is an unfathomable creative force, a tremendous power arising out of the depths of the human spirit. That is, not what one knows, but what one is becoming. In an effort to access the realm beyond the omniscient kingdom of rational knowledge, his thinking attempts to break away from a traditional metaphysical framework. Quote, perhaps the limits between this world and the other world are also essentially of experimental origin, neither rooted in the nature of our things as was thought before Kant, or in the nature of our reason as was thought after Kant. Perhaps indeed a partition does exist and makes vain all attempts to cross over, but perhaps there comes a moment when the partition is removed. End of quote. As Shestov has seen it, those who like
I
to say...
can't follow this at all, I'm afraid.
Sorry?
Who said? As Shestov has seen it, those who, like Dostoevsky, have received the gift of the second vision from the angel of death, have woken to reality by becoming conscious of their absurd existence. This new dimension of thought occurs when the emphasis on the content of thought has been removed and the passion of faith steps in. As David Patterson writes, the new or second dimension of thought unlocks the ineffable salvific truths because it lies in the passion of faith. It is what Kierkegaard describes as the leap of faith. Springing from despair, the new dimension of thought embraces contradiction, overriding the force of reason. Interestingly, William Desmond comments on the rhythm of Shestov's passion, pointing out that, quote, the flood of his passion is moderated by a superb intelligence and an ironical tartness, end of quote. In his determination to move philosophy from speculation towards revelation, Shestov places God above the truths of knowledge. In his view, biblical truth is not a substitute for knowledge, for it concerns itself neither with understanding nor with proofs. Similarly to Kierkegaard, Shestov recognizes in the biblical figures of Abraham and Job the willingness to overcome their anxieties and their ability to rise above the schooling of Socrates. For Kierkegaard, there can be no question that were Socrates and Job to come together before the court of ethics, Job would lose the case. The only way for Job to get back everything that was taken from him is to impugn the competence of ethics, because he knew with every conceivable probability that it would be impossible. Drawing on Kierkegaard, Shestov emphasizes that to seek the truth for Job meant to cast doubts on the basic principles of philosophic thinking. Faith is the paradox which no thought can grasp, because faith begins where thinking leaves off. In the presence of and through faith, an individual human discovers a new dimension of thought. In the second dimension, Shestov sees the possibility of the rebirth of thought and the beginning of a new life. In accord with his earlier argument on the incommensurability of faith and reason, Shestov draws a line between two types of faith: philosophical faith and faith in revelation. Moving the truth of speculative philosophy and the truth of revelation apart, Shestov identifies faith in revelation with freedom of faith in the living God of the Bible. According to him, reason fails before the eternally hidden and buries it under silence. And thus there can be only one kind of thinking, that is, the one of faith. In the style of Kierkegaard, Shestov's spiritual journey becomes a mad struggle for possibility of the divine salvation. Stemming from Kierkegaard's definition of faith as an insane struggle for the possible, Shestov conceives of faith as the possibility of the impossible, which he understands as the experience of the revelation of truth. The revealed truth initiates the beginning of a new life in freedom, which would enable the impossible to become possible. In Shestov's account, whereas reason excludes revelation, faith arises when all the fetters of rationality fall apart. He writes, quote, "Faith gives neither serenity, nor assurance, nor stability. As opposed to knowledge, it is never allowed the triumph of self-satisfaction. It is trembling, expectation, anxiety, strength, hope, constant presentiment of great unexpectedness, anxiety and dissatisfaction with the present, and impossibility of penetrating into the future." End of quote. Faith for Shestov is audacity, the denial of the laws of anarchy, and the refusal to regard anything as impossible. He aligns faith with freedom and the promise of the biblical revelation. From his perspective, therefore, there can be no reconciliation between scientific philosophy and religious philosophy, that is, his philosophy of the biblical revelation. In an attempt to overcome the metaphysical opposition between the temporal and the eternal, Shestov is able to extend his artistic vision beyond the limits of the comprehensible and the explicable. When faced with making a leap of faith that would carry him over the apophatic abyss into a relationship with God, I'm quoting David Patterson, Shestov rejected the rationality of Athens and pursued the passion of Jerusalem, end of quote. Adopting his new concept of thinking, the philosopher aspired for the creative freedom of infinite rebirths and renewals. To sum up, in Shestov's account, the sources and roots of life lie beyond the boundaries of reason. From his earlier writings, the philosopher's thoughts were captivated by the relationship between faith and reason. In his campaign against the claims of logocentric metaphysics, Shestov's thought was striving to liberate itself from all restrictions placed on it by rational knowledge. Shestov understood human freedom as a divine creation of new, unlimited, and infinite possibilities. For him, a new dimension of thought is the experience of the divine through unknowing. Hence, philosophy is an artistic tool in one's personal struggle for salvation, and not a reflection or contemplation. Persistent in his search for the other, different kind of truth, Shestov turned his close attention to the Bible. He proposed that the despair that seizes us when we are faced with observed reality leads us beyond the boundaries of rational thought to an act of faith. Like Kierkegaard, Shestov struggled against that philosophy which took reason to be the sole authority in determinations of truth. He argued that in the Western philosophical tradition, a living God of the Bible was replaced by metaphysical reason. As I have tried to demonstrate, drawn on his rejection of the authority of reason with its compulsion to believe in axiomatic self-evident truths, Shestov's predominantly theocentric worldview defined his philosophic inquiry. Few of Shestov's philosophical notions played as important a role in his religious outlook as that of transformation. In his search for the ultimate truth, Shestov focused his thoughts on the questions of faith and revelation, which in his view are capable of initiating sudden renewal processes that would stimulate a fundamental transformation of one's worldview. The shift of Shestov's thought into a new dimension manifested itself as a discovery of an unknown possibility, which would free one's mind from the limitations of speculative thinking. In the second dimension of thought, everything must be recreated, begun all over again. In Shestov's religious philosophy, which is centered on faith, revelation displaces speculation. Significantly, Shestov was neither a preacher nor a theologian. He aimed to present the dilemma of life in all its acuteness and as he saw it. For him, there was no possibility of accommodation between rational philosophy and biblical faith. For the God of Jerusalem cannot be proved by rational argument or inferred from historical evidence. Shestov's untamable vision was rooted in his conviction that human reason and knowledge cannot fully comprehend the mere absurdity of human existence. Shestov has heard the mysterious creator of the universe speak of the truth of revelation about man created in the image of God, when he saw that beyond reason and knowledge lies the impossible. Thank you.